David. It's okay. I think we'll manage. I've got them fairly big when you need to do it, and if there's lots of names, it's when you just need to see there are lots of names near the end. Okay, so lots of sources, histories written by English writers, and charters in increasing numbers. And here's a wonderful display of that. And there are also a few pieces of legislation. Well, there's two I'll talk about. And I'll focus particularly, though, on sources for David I's rule in Scotland, and not simply as quarries of information, but as prisms for David's kingship, as this was understood at the time. So, the most accessible kind of written material for his reign are histories. As we will see, their prose is memorable and easy to follow. David I was a prominent figure in England, so it is not surprising that he's mentioned by English writers in this period. Unfortunately, there is nothing equivalent that survives from the Scottish kingdom datable to David I's reign. Instead of the engaging prose of a history, there is the jejune year-by-year chronicle, known to scholars as the Holyrood Chronicle, which might, from 1150, have been written in Holyrood. And as you can see, it's pretty bare. And I should mention that although the Chronicle of Melrose covers this period, it is likely prior to 1153 to represent a copy or adaptation of a Northern English chronicle. So, as far as Scottish historical texts of any kind, datable to David's reign, are concerned, we are limited to king lists and genealogies, which provide us with next to no narrative detail. However, embedded in a later king list, we find what appears to be parts of a tract, mainly on David I's pious sisters, Matilda, Queen of England, and Mary, Countess of Boulogne, and David's foundation of nunneries. And this can be dated to sometime between 1136 and 1152, only part of it is given in the slide. Holiness is presented in this text as a particularly female affair, exemplified by David's sisters and sustained by his foundation of nunneries, as well as other monasteries. English historians, writing during David's reign, portray him not only as a pious king, as we heard yesterday from Richard, but as civilizer of the Scots, and we heard a bit about that too. Two authors provide us with particularly vivid impressions of David in this way. That's Aelred, of Abbot of the Cistercian Monastery of Rievaulx in Yorkshire, and William, monk of Malmesbury Abbey in Wiltshire. So I'll return to Aelred in more detail towards the end of my talk because of his close relationship with David I. He was a member of David's household during the first 10 years of David's reign, and as we heard yesterday, he wrote a powerful portrait of David shortly after his death. William of Malmesbury's relationship with David I, by contrast, was remote. He could only refer to what he had heard about him. His feelings for David are nonetheless notable, as is made clear in the covering letter that William wrote to David I in the first edition of his History of the English Kings, completed in 1126. And there he addressed David as his lord and as sole heir to the line of saintly kings of England, and asked his permission to send his History of the English Kings to David's niece Matilda, the Empress Matilda, who was then in Normandy. William of Malmesbury penned a famous character sketch of David when referring to David's accession as king in 1124. He described him as a young man of more courtly disposition than the rest, who, quote, had from boyhood been polished by familiar intercourse with the English and rubbed off all the barbarian rust of Scottish manners. For example, soon after his accession, he gave a 3-year exemption from the payment of dues to any of his countrymen who was prepared to raise his standard of comfort in housing, of elegance in dress, and of civility in diet. What this 3-year thing was, I don't know. Answers in the back of a postcard. Aelred, for his part, referred to David taming the total barbarity of the people he ruled, so that, quote, forgetting its natural fierceness, it submitted its necks to the laws which the king's meekness dictated, and gratefully accepted peace, of which it knew nothing up to that point, a passage that Richard gave us yesterday as well. In another passage, Aelred described how David had transformed Scotland from a harsh land of famine to a fertile country with trading ports, castles, and cities. The people, he said, were no longer naked or clothed with rough cloaks, but wore fine linen and purple cloth. Their savage behaviour had been calmed by the Christian religion. Now, John Gillingham has shown how English writers in this period saw their Celtic neighbours as barbarians in a way that had not occurred before. This reflected the espousal by the leaders of English society of codes of behaviour in war in which slaving was condemned and the killing and maiming of elite opponents was avoided. For William of Malmesbury, David belonged to this civilised world, but his own people did not. Aelred of Rievaulx, on the other hand, acknowledged David's role in leading armies into the north of England that committed atrocities. Aelred's vision of civilization reflected the mission of new monastic orders to establish what in their eyes was a truly Christian society, inspired by their own example. The need for fundamental social change was made compelling by espousing an extreme image of what uncivilization looked like, and this was achieved by othering England's Celtic neighbours. Aelred's version of this was to portray the Scots as a barbaric people tamed by a king like David, who lived a chaste, frugal, and devout life that was as close to being a monk as a reigning king could be. Now, this is not to say that William and Aelred created a completely false view of David I, and I'll return to this at the end. It is simply that they can best be read as projecting a particular worldview. Now, the persuasive power of their writing, however, makes it difficult to resist the influence of their image of David I, even subliminally, when interpreting the workmanlike prose of a plain document. A past historian cannot be blamed, therefore, for highlighting a charter of David I, in which David threatened any of the Céridés on St. Serf's Isle, Lochleven, with expulsion if they refused to accept the Augustinian order. This was seen as an example of David as an innovator, providing for, I quote, the extinction or absorption of outdated communities, end of quotes. Now, it all fits so readily with the idea of David the civilizer that it probably hardly seemed necessary to look further. Looking further, however, leads us to David I granting the bishop and Céridés of Brechin a market every Sunday, a significant favour that allowed the Céridés of Brechin not only to survive, but to thrive as a hub of the local economy under the king's protection. If David could favour the Céridés of Brechin, why was he so harsh on the Céridés of St. Serf's Isle, Lochleven? The answer is found in a charter of Robert, Bishop of St. Andrews, linked to the same event. St. Serf's Isle and its possessions had been owned by bishops of St. Andrews since the mid-10th century. In Bishop Robert's charter, he handed it over, lock, stock and barrel, to the Augustinian Priory of St. Andrew's Cathedral, which Bishop Robert founded in 1140, but he was struggling to find sufficient resources to support. Seen in this light, King David's charter was assisting the Bishop of St. Andrews in making his new priory sustainable. It was not about David as an innovator doing away with Céridés communities in general. A similar case is David I's famous charter giving Annandale to Robert Bruce. Here, surely, is a tangible example of the new knightly culture that David imbibed during his English upbringing. We look in vain, however, for a statement that Annandale was held as a heritable few for knight service. The phrase, few and heritage, occurs in a charter of David I, giving and granting Annandale to Robert Bruce's son towards the end of his reign. But, curiously, only a singular heir is mentioned. The full panoply of holding heritably by knight service is only stated in William the Lion's charter for the same Robert Bruce sometime around 1170. Alice Taylor has shown that this is part of a wider pattern in which the idea of exercising lordship heritably from the king became the norm from the 1170s. So that's a generation after David's reign. The most eye-catching words in David I's first Annandale charter, however, are at the end, where it is stated that the charter was given at Scone. It's very tempting to imagine this happened at the time of David I's inauguration in 1124, especially because it is likely that David had installed Bruce as Lord of Annandale at least 4 years earlier. The charter would therefore have served to emphasise that the lordship of Annandale was within David's realm as King of Scots. Towards the end of a typical charter, there is a list of witnesses who are singled out in order to take responsibility for verifying the transaction in the future. In the light of this, it is not surprising that the witness list in this charter includes knights who David had depended on to control his principality in the south before he became king, and perfectly understandable that no one from the kingdom's heartlands north of the Firth of Forth is named. The witness list, however, has been seen as reinforcing an image of David at his inauguration as king, dressed in Norman style, surrounded by Anglo-Norman followers with similar attire. And this resonates, of course, with William of Malmesbury's depiction of David as a beacon of English society in a barbaric country. For my own sake, I imagine that David at his inauguration would have sported distinctive clothing that marked him out as king, so he wouldn't have been like anybody else, but that's way beyond my brief and competence. Be this as it may, Scone is not uncommon as the place where David's charters were given. A total of 12 survive. The only other places in double figures are Edinburgh with 14, Stirling with 13, Dunfermline with 12, and Roxburgh with 10, and the balance between north and south of the Forth is roughly equal. Only 4 extant charters, however, were given in places north of the Tay, and this could tempt the unwary into concluding that David's rule north of the Tay Basin was only nominal, especially in the first decade of his reign. Joe Tucker, however, has recently emphasised how uneven the pattern of survival of charters is for the whole period up to 1314, and for example in this map. Each black dot represents a significant church prior to 1314, which might be expected to have received and kept charters, but for which none survives. The other symbols show different degrees of archival survival. The archives of noble families are even less likely to survive. The Bruces of Annandale are actually a very unusual case. If we focus in on David I's charters, along with those of his son Henry, who predeceased him, only a few churches have significant numbers of charters surviving as originals or copies. Only Aberdeen lies north of the Tay. About 70% are accounted for by 4 churches, 2 in Fife and 2 in the eastern borders. A relative absence of charters cannot therefore be said to show that David himself was relatively absent from a region. And there is, in fact, a tangible indication of David's regular presence in the kingdom's heartlands. At Montrose, he enacted that judges should attend the king on the first night he entered their province. If they left without the king's permission, they would be liable to a fine of 8 cows, which was a fairly standard fine. The judge, Iudex in Latin, was a member of the Gallic learned orders, and this is one of only 2 pieces of legislation that Alice Taylor identified as a genuine enactment of David I in her groundbreaking study of medieval Scottish legal compilations. In the other enactments, David established the place within each province between the Firth of Forth and the River Spey, where disputed goods would be brought. Both pieces of legislation show not only that David I took an active interest in this part of his realm, but that he also sought to make its existing legal system work more effectively. If he recognised that the region between the Forth and the Spey, known in the 12th century as Scotland, had its own laws and customs, then he presumably regarded his realm as an amalgam of different countries and ruled them accordingly. He could make radical changes in areas like the old kingdom of Strathclyde, Cumbria, and Murray by introducing new elites. In Scotland itself, he generally governed through existing structures and personnel. David's relationship with the Northeast is most vividly brought to light. When David established where disputed goods were to be brought in each province, however, he made an exception north of the Mouth. Instead of designating a place in Buchan and a place in Mar, he directed that stolen goods were to be brought to Aberdeen. Now, this is not the only indication of his particular interest in the Northeast. There are good grounds for supposing that he made Aberdeen the seat of a bishopric no later than 1132, although there is no extant active foundation, of course. Now, David's relationship with the Northeast is most vividly brought to light by the most remarkable documentary survival from his reign, a gospel book with Gaelic property records written into blank spaces by the clerics of Deir in Buchan. The final record is a Latin charter of David I, in which he ordered that the clerics of Deir should be free from the demands made on them by local elites, as written in their property records, argued by them in Banff, and vouched for at Aberdeen. Deir is not alone in the Gaelic world and elsewhere in having property records written into a gospel book. It is unique, however, in using a small, portable codex, it's about half the size of this, a small portable codex for this purpose, rather than their most impressive gospel book kept on the high altar. And it's tempting to suppose that it was their intention all along to use the property records in their mini gospel book as evidence in a legal forum, rather than relying only on the sacredness of their holiest book to safeguard their rights. Be this as it may, their efforts culminated in taking it to David I in Aberdeen, who placed his royal authority fully behind their claims. It's already becoming apparent in this brief survey of written sources for David as King of Scots that when we turn our gaze away from Aelred of Rievaulx and William of Malmesbury as our primary points of reference, and train our eyes on more mundane sources and focus on them on their own terms, a more complex picture of David I comes into view. Each of our sources or source types shows David as king in different ways. The most prevalent is charters. Most that survive show him as patron of monastic foundations, but there are also a few where he is giving lordship or instructing officials in boroughs. There are other examples, some known only through later charters, where he supports older religious communities or issues instructions in the payment of teens, the tenth of agricultural produce, due to all churches in the diocese. We also have instances of David as legislator, working with the Gaelic learned orders and the age-old structure of provinces in Scotland proper, and of David's protection of Gaelic clerics in their struggle for freedom from local elites. These sources are, of course, inherently limited, particularly by patterns of survival. They also allow us, at best, to glimpse David I as a person. So we gravitate naturally to narrative sources, which, by their nature, provide some sense of David I as an individual. William of Malmesbury's brief account shows us David's reputation in an English setting. Aelred's passionate portrayal, by contrast, is intense and intimate. Aelred's eulogy of David is, of course, primarily a source for Aelred's own view of kingship, as Richard Oram was explaining yesterday. His close relationship with David, however, means that Aelred's image of the monk king, as it were, is likely to have been something that David himself identified with, especially as it chimes so loudly with what is known about the image of holy royalty that his elder sister, Matilda, Queen of England, espoused, especially as she was David's mentor in his youth. It is, however, as king that we celebrate David's anniversary today. And when we treat each source on its own terms as representing a dimension of his kingship, not the whole picture, ranging from Aelred's vivid prose to the most prosaic charters, a richer and more varied picture of David's interactions with his subjects and with their expectations of him emerges than might be anticipated otherwise. But there is much more to say about the sources for his reign, of course, than I've been able to sketch today. And I haven't mentioned, of course, coins, castles, and churches beyond my brief, but really important, obviously. I'd like to finish with what might seem the most tedious and unpromising text of all, The genealogy of the kings of Scots, tracing David's descent through 130 generations. See, I haven't managed to get it all onto the slide. And that goes father to son, with one exception, back to Noah. Aelred presented David as descendant of pre-conquest kings of England through his mother Margaret, and charted each generation back to Noah and Adam via Woden. This English heritage was certainly very important for Scottish kings from David onwards. As King of Scots, however, David was his father's son, topping a roll call of about 90 Gaelic names, including kings of Dauvit and legendary kings of Ireland, back to the first Gael to have taken Ireland. That's Milith Espana, who's bottom of the list there. So we might legitimately ask how this might have had any meaning for anybody apart from the members of the Gaelic learned orders. And the answer is found in a text headed by David himself, where the names have been carefully converted in order to make them accessible to readers unfamiliar with Gaelic spelling conventions. As a result, it was possible for each name to be pronounced much as it would have been in Gaelic itself, albeit, of course, in an English or French accent if the reciter spoke no Gaelic. This version, updated to David's grandson William, was copied diligently by Rolf of Diss, Dean of St. Paul's, in about 1185 in his account of recent history. And it is striking, and I've gone through every name meticulously, it is striking how it was then copied equally diligently by scribes in or near London within William's lifetime, in 5 more manuscripts derived from Diss's work. It is possible here to see how David could remain indelibly part of the Gaelic-speaking society on which his identity as king depended, whilst at the same time being involved with English affairs, Norman knights, and new monastic orders. Be this as it may, there is a final indication of Gaelic's prominence at the heart of David's government when he died. The Chancellor needed to change the king's name on the royal seal matrix. It might be expected that this would be rendered as Malcolmus in Latin, based on the English version of the name. Malcolm, English, Malcolmus, Latin, were by this time the forms used in English and Latin. Instead, the decision was taken to identify the new king as Gaelic Mul Colum, spelt in a way that was legible to those unfamiliar with Gaelic spelling conventions. So to conclude very quickly, I began by noting that David I is the first Scottish king for whom a significant variety and volume of sources survives. Throughout my brief discussion, I have highlighted how vivid narratives have naturally, and sometimes unconsciously, influenced the way other sources have been interpreted, and I've suggested that if we embrace every source, including narratives, in their own right, we will gain a richer understanding of David I's kingship. If we have to start somewhere, however, the most significant statements of Scottish kingship from a contemporary perspective would be the royal genealogy, possibly read out at each king's inauguration, and the king's seal. In both, we can see the fundamental role of Gaelic and Scottish kingship throughout David's reign. Thank you very much.